Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. All stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book, and it is Little Blue Book, number 1791. Is that what it is? Yep. Titled Freethought and Agnosticism, Lies and Confusion in Conventional Literature. Written by Joseph McCabe. Now, when it says conventional literature, it's copyright 1943, so that's the conventional literature it's referring to. So, here we go. Chapter 1, there is no chapter listing. It's just, there you go. All right, so Chapter 1, an examination of the evidences for the God idea. It is my aim to help the reader to reach a sound attitude to life and its problems, to understand in particular how the world drifted into the terrible tragedy of our time, and how it is to be reconstructed with a super prospect of security and progress. Surer prospect. The fundamental problem that this generation has to face is why the peaceful populations of the earth, who are several times more numerous and wealthy than the bandit populations, allowed them to create sufficient military forces to launch their aggressive plans. Of this, there are only two theories. One is that the foreign offices, military bureaus, and editorial offices of America, Britain, and France were honestly misled by the peaceful pretension of Hitler, Mussolini, and Matsuoka. That sort of thing might pass in a conventicle of Plymouth Brethren. There has not been the least secrecy about the German, Italian, and Japanese plans, at least since 1930. So the second theory is today beyond serious dispute. These fascists promise to destroy socialism and communism and to cripple Russia. So we let them go ahead. Someday historians and sociologists may say that was a crime, only second to that of the fascists. Yet the Christian churches of Italy and Germany, as the native religions of Japan, enthusiastically supported the bandits. That is, what we set out to understand in the present essay. It is not enough to say that the priesthoods have always been the allies of wealth and privilege, but one is not surprised that even members of the churches floundered about in search of an explanation once they perceived the truth. For as part of that policy of suppressing uncongenial facts, which nearly the whole press of the world has adopted, to the gravest detriment of the race, our papers concealed from their records the fact that not only in Russia, but in a score of other countries, communism or socialism had in about 15 years detached tens, if not hundreds of millions of members from the Christian body. I will go into detail about that remarkable revolution a little later. It will be useful first to get a clear idea of its meaning and of the attitude of the rebels. The immense majority of them became atheists. To our Walter Lippmanns, to say nothing of our radio Jesuits, that is just a symptom of an empty or a superficial mind. If you want to find out how deep these gentlemen really are read up, what has happened to these tens of millions of rebels against the churches, or, since it is chiefly a question of this, the Roman Church? The most terrible pressure, the concentration camp, jail, torture, even death, has been used against them by the Pope's fascist allies in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and South America. And that pressure has to be sustained year after year because the clergy know the moment freedom is granted, they will all return to their open profession of atheism. Origen, the greatest scholar of the early church, was once taunted by a pagan who said that the Christians must be as disloyal as the Jews, seeing how the Roman government had to treat them. And Origen, writing 100 years after the Neronian persecution, replied that he could count on your fingers all the Christians who had been put to death to that time. Someday we shall know how many thousand atheists this church and its friends, Mussolini, Horthy, Petain, Franco, Salazar, Vargas, etc., put to death, and how many tens of thousands it tortured in not 120, but 20 years. These moralists and literary men who talk about atheism are not only totally ignorant of psychology, but their knowledge of contemporary life, on which they make such penetrating observations, is as blurred, inexact, and incomplete as, let us say, their knowledge of astronomy. The time has gone by when the sectarian quarrels of the various branches of the Christian church interested the general public. Do you not find people drifting from one church to another in crowds as they used to do? The most lavishly propagandist of them all, the Roman Church, with its enormous wealth for that purpose, claims only about 20,000 converts out of 100 million people a year, and these are largely folks who join it for social, marriage, and etc., or economic or artistic reasons. Our oracles have a large way of saying that of course people are not so interested in church doctrines as they once were, but they are still religious and theistic, and they resent atheism. This very common plea reads nicely in the Sunday supplement or the weekly, but the oracles never attempt to explain how it is that the churches which reduce doctrine to a minimum or do not insist on any doctrine at all, the Congregationalists, the Unitarian churches, remain the smallest and make no progress. If their diagnosis of the religious condition of a modern community were sound, we ought to see these bodies, which confine themselves to the worship of God or even to ethical culture, swollen with recruits for the hundreds of thousands who quit the doctrinal churches every year. The correct diagnosis is that, while probably half of the community never thinks about religion at all, the interest of the remainder, who are not members of the organized churches, has passed to the foundations of all religion. Once it was a burning question whether the flood covered the whole earth, and whether a whale swallowed a man who used its belly as a dugout for several days. Then it was, and with many still is, a burning question whether the papacy is a divine institution or the scarlet whore. Whether you must confess your sins to a priest, whether we are all born in sin because of the days of King David of Mesopotamia, a lady robbed an orchard, and so on. We are more interested today in Claudette Colbert or a miner's strike. Turning over the other day one of those medieval chronicles which I love so much, I found that in the city of Rizecchia in the 15th century, a Dominican preacher said that at his resurrection from the dead, Jesus got the whole of his blood back into his veins. Then a Franciscan preacher came along and said no, not the whole of it, because he did not bother about odds and ends like what he shed at his circumcision. The city divided into two armed and monstrously inflamed camps, the full-bloodies and the not full-bloodies, and they had to call upon the Pope and eventually the troops to prevent a pitched battle. About the same time, a friar of Siena stole the Virgin's wedding ring, which was the greatest treasure of that city, and sold it to the rival city of Perugia. And when the Pope sent a cardinal to arrest the friar and prevent war, the Perugians put up a fight that would have frightened the Gestapo. We are no longer interested in these holy matters. The question is there a God? Have we queer mortals really got immortal souls? Most folk outside of the churches have perhaps lost interest in the second question and are rather ribald about it. In fact, that terrible infant of the Anglo-American church, Dr. Inge, I-N-G-E, Inge, says of his co-religionists, as well as the general public, the hope of personal immortality burns very dimly among us. The topic is mainly reserved for letters of condolence and then handled gingerly. Most working men are much more anxious to get another dollar a day, and the golden harp is a thing of merriment. The question of the existence of God is fast falling to the same level. Belief in God is dead in England, said one of the most learned and most candid of British bishops, Gore. But when they republished his book after his death, they cut that out. However, I have to explain very briefly how this economic and political stimulation, which spread to tens of millions of folk after the last war, destroyed also their belief in God. In a word, they began to think. With the vast majority of believers, God is a family heirloom, or, like the president or the doormat, a normal part of the environment. If you care to try the experiment, as I have done, you will be surprised at the very large proportion of non-churchgoers who do not know whether they believe in God or not. I don't know. I suppose there must be, says one. I don't know. I don't think there can be, says the next. But of 10 women whom I asked, or got working people to ask for me recently, 7 promptly and profanely said, not likely in a world like this, or words to that effect. Once they had been content with the easygoing formula, if God didn't make the world, who did? Now, as I personally heard a working class woman say, it is, well, if there is a God, it must be a German. Ooh. Superficial? Yes, just as superficial as the average man or woman's belief. Nobody ever gave them any reason for the belief except in an occasional sermon to say that you deduce the existence of God from the existence and the features of the world. For this generation especially, those who lived through the last war, as well as this and the depression between the two, the earth might be said to proclaim the power of a devil, but not the glory of a God. The flowers are less conspicuous than the blood and tears. The parson has had his bread buttered on both sides too long. On sunny days, he said, behold the kind hand of God. On dismal days, he said, how can you with your finite mind hope to penetrate the counsels of the infinite? In prosperity, he asked us to thank God and pay up. In adversity, to bow to the mystery. Poor folk have not the subtlety of philosophers. There was an ethical preacher in Chicago, a student of philosophy, who found God in the soul of the American people. In the last war, he became a Unitarian parson and was rather embarrassed to find that most of his colleagues did not believe in God. There is a British philosopher, Dr. Joad, who has found God in the war world of today. Most folk have not the advantage of a training in philosophy. But as I said, vast numbers of folk were stimulated to begin thinking about the last war. Let us admit that most of them probably did not sit down to a very serious consideration of this question of God. They just threw the whole religious bag of tricks overboard. It was the opium of the people. It was, by the way, not Karl Marx, but the Reverend Charles Kingsley who invented that phrase. Or just part of the fraudulent prospectus of the Clerical Economic Corporation. But those who did do a little reading on the subject found that the superficial impulse of the majority was sound. The evidences were inferences from aspects of nature. The underdevout astronomer is mad, said the 18th century poet. Now, the most devout of the astronomers, Eddington, ridicules the idea that the heavens proclaim the glory of God. Then there was the order and beauty of nature. Science has still many obscurities to clear up, but certainly not the beauty of sunsets, landscapes, mountains, crystals, etc., and, as I said, the orchids and roses, every feature of which can be explained without God, are not so impressive just now as the bestiality of Japs and Nazis, the red flames of war, the agony of millions. An American preacher invented the phrase, which became very popular, that we are cooperating with God. Well, we are doing our best, but God, according to the experts, could have prevented the whole bloody business. As to the old jargon about a first cause and prime mover, there is some fundamental stuff of the universe, and you may, if you like, deck it in capital letters, but it is what the Germans call an Ersatz God. The truth is that the more thoughtful religious writers now mildly ridicule these old arguments themselves, there is none so poor as to do them reverence, says one. Let him speak for himself and his cultured colleagues amongst more than half the religious folk of America, Catholics, bishops, or Baptists, and a high proportion of the Methodists, etc., that spurious coinage circulates as bright as ever. Though in both philosophy and science it is completely discredited, it is the reasoning of the Middle Ages, of the folk who were fully convinced though on that point, that had merely to consult experience, that comets caused pestilence and forebode the assassination of princes, or that rat's blood, fibers of the hangman's rope, and ground hippopotamus tooth were good medicines. And what new evidences do these clerics, who have parted with our dear old friends, the old arguments, offer us? They almost insult the educated modern intelligence. Just when psychology had completely discarded the words instinct and intuition, they claim that we have a religious instinct and an intuition of the existence of God. Just when we have fully developed a science of ethics and traced the evolution of the moral sense from the lowest savages onward, they say that conscience is so mysterious that we can understand it only as the voice of God. They richly share our indignation when the Nazis shoot 100 men and women because they cannot catch the man who has shot a traitor or a bully, and then they placidly say that God is punishing us for our sins when they see tens of millions of innocent folk in Poland, occupied Russia, China, etc., suffering years of torture. It does not take a philosopher. Indeed, some philosophers have written books to confirm the clerical sophistry, to see through this screen of verbiage. It is a tissue of transparent fallacies. Much of it, in fact, is so transparent that it is hardly entitled to be called a fallacy, because a fallacy does make some show of plausibility. This practice of inferring God from features of man is not seriously plausible today. Science, as Comte said, has conducted God to its frontiers, thanking him for his provisional services. And when we turn to genuine history, we are not so ready as the positivist leader was to talk about provisional services. That's the end of chapter 1. My nose is itchy. We're going to pause there for a hydration break. Hydrate, Maddie. All hydration breaks are brought to you by my friend Maddie. Chapter 2. Great numbers of free thinkers. It is more important to appreciate the magnitude of the defection from the churches during the 20 years after the last war or since the Russian Revolution. Though the ecclesiastical development since 1918 is plain enough, most people allow themselves to have their recollection of the events of 10 years, if not 2 years ago, disturbed by journalistic sophistry in the interest of those who want the facts forgotten. I must not require my readers to look up annuals for the past 20 years and have not space to reproduce them here. But this fact will emerge in the memory of every man or woman who cares to reflect from 1919 onward. For at least 2 decades, the only preoccupation of the churches, apart from their chronic and arduous duty of controlling other people's private affairs, was to create a heavy prejudice against, if not hatred of, Soviet Russia. Why? Some may agree with the Catholic oracle that the right of private ownership, or the opportunity to make 10 or 100 times as many dollars as ordinary folk, is so sacred and precious a social institution that the churches are guardians of the social welfare. We're bound to flame against the Soviet leaders. Some may agree with the cynic that the churches were consistently adhering to their age-old policy of siding with wealth and privilege against the people. Most of us, recollecting the worldwide and entirely false screech about the persecution of religion, which was officially discredited by the British government in the House of Commons, will grant that the clergy were simply minding their own business, self-preservation. Ecclesiasticism was threatened with ruin. From China came the news that atheistic communism was sweeping province after province, and it so muddled the brains and shattered the passions of the rabble that they made no distinction between missionaries and moneylenders and swept both out of the country. In Hungary, the name of Bela Khan spread terror in the Sacretists. Easygoing Bavaria reported an outbreak. Shiploads of red-hot literature from Russia were said to be, and were, landing at South American ports. Italy was said to be overrun by these bloodthirsty Bolsheviks, and they were making rapid progress in France, Belgium, and other countries. I'm not writing ancient history. The warning cannot be repeated too often that all this hatred of Russia, or at least all the machinery for inspiring hatred and distrust, has merely been suspended until the war is over. Yeah, that was true. Yesterday, I heard, as you probably did, Mr. Churchill addressing Congress. Russia was magnificent. Russia was holding up 4 million Germans, although it had lost a third of its men and resources. We must rush to the aid of Russia. That is to say, we must do everything in our power that is sensible and practicable to take more of the weight off Russia in 1943. Tell me the old story. By the summer or fall of 1944, Russia's might will be terribly reduced, and it will think of little but repairing its ravages. But the might of America and Britain will be such that they can dictate to the planet, once more we shall see, or you will see if I don't, the warm and fragrant alliance of wealth, privilege, and religion. That's what we saw. Vague statements that communist and socialistic atheism was sweeping the world in those 20 years, though fully supported by such writers on the subject as the Jesuit Bishop de Herbigny, strange, are not the kind of stuff that I offer to my readers. Let us try to get at least approximate figures. There are safest in the case of Russia. These are safest in the case of Russia, where we may say confidently that more than 70 million folk have quit the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church and abandoned all religion since 1918. Yaroslavsky's round estimate that a few years ago only about one-third of the people of the Soviet Union still belonged to the Church is generally accepted. Foreign journalists in Russia have a trick of sending home jubilant messages about the crowded churches at certain seasons. They omit to state that at Easter, for instance, largely peasants from the country crowded into Moscow and other cities to visit the specially holy churches and relics. There are not enough churches open in Russia to accommodate more than a third of the population. Now, we do not know what the number of freethinkers in Russia was before the revolution, but practically skepticism was confined to the middle classes, which was proportionately much smaller than in more advanced countries, and a certain number of city workers. Beyond question, the number of seceders from 1918 is over 70 million. The number of members of the Society for the Active Propaganda of Atheism is an entirely different matter. From Russia, the heresy easily passed into Germany. That country was, before the last war, in something like the same condition as England from the religious viewpoint. In England, about a third or a fourth of the population still adhered to the churches in 1914. In Germany, with its far higher proportion of peasants and small town folk, the rates would be rather higher. The religious figures given by the government every year in the Jaharbunk, couldn't tell you, were, of course, nonsense. 2/3 of the country were said to be Protestant and 1/3 Catholics, except for a negligible riffraff of Jews, dissenters, and infidels. Taking into account the size of the Social Democratic Party, which was pledged to oppose all churches, we might say that churchless folk were about a third of the population by 1931. The 1/3 had grown to more than half and possibly 2/3 at the November election. 35 million or more than half the population voted, and of these, nearly 25 million voted for Nazism, socialism, or communism, which at that time were almost equally detested by the churches. If we make a liberal allowance for religious folk voting for Hitler in defiance of their churches, it was after this election that the Vatican entered into alliance with Hitler. We see that the churches must still be, as I suggested. To put it differently, the Catholic vote was 5 million, indicating a total membership of 10 million to 12 million, and a loss of more than 12 million to the socialist and communist. There is no reason to suppose that the Lutheran Church lost less to them. Practically all these seceders became atheists. In Italy, where both communism and socialism were empathetically banned by the Vatican, a similar examination of the election statistics proves that between 1918 and 1929, socialism and communism had, in spite of the Vatican's sternest condemnation, won half the population. The bulk of the middle-class liberals had been anti-Catholic for at least a quarter of a century. By 1928, the great majority of the artisans and a large portion of the peasants were atheists. So also were the early fascists, until Mussolini gave the order for tactical reconciliation with the papacy. At least 15 million people left the church for atheism between 1918 and 1928. In Spain, most of the cities gave a 2/3 majority vote for the anti-clerical government set up at the revolution. Here, communism had, contrary to the myths of the American press, little influence, but the socialists and liberals who held power were equally atheistic, and the anarchists and syndicalists who stood outside the government and are not included in the election statistics, as they never voted, were even more violently anti anti-religious. The atheistic wave of the 10 years after the war swept from 10 to 15 million out of the church in Spain and Portugal. France was already predominantly atheistic in 1918. French Catholic writers freely admitted that the church had the adhesion of only about 1/5 of the population, and few Frenchmen go in for those finer shades of heresy between atheism and Catholicism. There were, and are, though now muzzled, 30 million atheists in France, but we have no means of determining the growth of atheism in that country between 1918 and 1938. There was a notable growth of it in Europe generally. In Holland, 8 million people, no less than 1,144,393 declared at the census of 1930 that they had no religion, though it is well known that those who so describe themselves in the census paper are only the more em- empathic atheists. Yeah, empathic atheists. In Czechoslovakia, practically in the Czech part alone, for Slovakia is an agricultural region of priest-ridden peasants, nearly a million declared no religion, and other figures show that atheists had really increased to about 3 million, while Catholic writers admitted that their church had lost 2 million since 1918. In number 2 of my Freethinkers library, I have made a more thorough analysis of the figures than I can make here, but I must refer to 2 further items before I sum up. To the total of atheists created by the communist advance after 1918, we must add at least 50 million Chinese, for as everybody will remember, the communists controlled at one time 2 great provinces of China, and their no God movement, or as journalists called it, why not say simply atheist, spread rapidly in other parts of China and Indochina. I have estimated that Asia, apart from Siberia, contributed at at least 60 million recruits to atheism in the 20 years, but the growth in India is very difficult to ascertain, and may greatly increase the figure. Such was the world movement that when a religious clause was inserted in the census of the Union of South Africa, 3,062,669 of the 5 million colored folk declared that they had no religion. Add also Turkey, where the splendid work of the atheist President Ataturk induced millions to reject Islam. The second point is the growth of atheism in conjunction with socialism and communism in Latin America. My first acquaintance with Latin America was stimulating. I took the streetcar from El Paso to Ciudad Juarez one Sunday morning about 10 years ago and found most of the men of the small town defiantly holding a socialist meeting in the plaza before the church, while the women, including the girls of the brothel colony, whom I saw demurely, prayer books in hand, marching to the church, went inside for Mass. Except in a few towns, which were known as Catholic towns. I found that situation all over Mexico and the Yucatan. The political history of South America and the reports of American missionaries appraised to me later that until the movement was checked by military dictators in alliance with the clergy, the revolt against religion spread all over the Latin half of the continent. Chile and Peru were always regarded by the Vatican as just as safe as Air and Poland, and for the same reason. They were on the drowsy fringe of civilization. Yet in Peru in 1921, the president of the American Popular Revolutionary Association, all atheist, would have become president of the republic but for reactionary cheating. And in 1932, a socialist atheist government won power in Chile. Missionaries complained that in Brazil and Argentina, the workers would not have a Christian in their trade unions. At the least, the politico-religious revolt of 1918 to 1928 had added 15 million and probably well over 20 million recruits to atheism in Latin America. If these figures, which are a careful study of the best authorities, I take it to be minimal and added together, we find that the atheist movement, which began in Russia in 1918, had won nearly 200 million recruits before the period of bloody reaction began, with the alliance of the Pope and Mussolini in 1929. Nearly all literature still speaks with reverence of the miracle of the growth of early Christianity, striking a rough average of the different estimates of the best authorities it made about 5 million nominal Christians in 250 years out of a population of 100 million. And all but a few hundred of them apostatized in the Diocletian persecution. Atheism made about 200 million recruits in 10 to 15 years, and the press and the literary gentlemen never mention the fact. Such is still our educational environment. Moreover, while we still hear a lot about the mythical persecution of religious folks by Bolsheviks, one of the most solid facts of recent history is that this vast body of atheists was created by free discussion, but it has been broken up by or driven into the silence or sullen conformity in most countries in the last 10 years by brutal violence. That does not seem to prevent writer after writer from repeating that atheism releases the passion of the mob and leads to violence, while religion inspires humanity and is the guarantee of freedom. That's the end of chapter 2. And that makes the end of part 1 of Little Blue Book number 1091, titled Freethought and Agnosticism. Lies and Confusion of Conventional Literature, written by Joseph McCabe. Let me get my finger out of the way. Copyright 1943. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.